Thank you, James, for hosting this talk today, and also to Jim for coming over from the NIWM Memorial. That's where I gave the last talk for the museum, and it's wonderful to be in this space today and to be a part of this, be a part of PRONI, which is a wonderful institution for Northern Ireland and the UK. And I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk to you today. It's always incredible that on the nicest day of the year, I want to give a talk on the Holocaust and you want to attend. I think, well, we just sort of found each other, didn't we? This is part of a series marking the liberation of Europe 80 years ago this spring in 1945. In fact, it was the liberations of the Soviet Red Army that had begun the previous summer, that is the summer of 1944 at Majdanek. This was, oh, I forgot, this is a, people like to know what's going to happen to them, what's coming up. This is a little outline of the talk today, which will go on for about 40 minutes. Very rapid, impressionistic pastiche of a number of some sub-themes in the post-war history of the liberations and the acquisition of knowledge about what had occurred in the camps. And first, I will talk a little bit about the rescue and return of the surviving prisoners. Then I'll look at the problem of the transmission, the early transmission of the camp experience for both for Jews and Gentiles alike. We'll look at the creation of the canon of testimonies. And then I want to do a kind of survey of some of the highs and lows of the representations. And then I want to give you a little tour of some of the memorials and museums that I would recommend to you, and some that I wouldn't. And then we're going to look at the future and the future of the field and of the research and where I think it's going. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, if you could take a look at this map, that even though we marked the end of the war with VE Day and also the liberation of Auschwitz in the end of January 1945, in fact, these events that we commemorate began earlier in the summer of 1944 with the liberation of Majdanek, which is located here just in the town of Lublin, near the Ukraine border, what was the Soviet Ukraine. The other main sites of the extermination in the East, they were never liberated because they had served their purpose and they were dismantled before the end of the war. So the main sites, for example, Belzec, Treblinka, Chelmno, these places, never mind Ponary, these, which I'll talk about in a moment, these had already been completely destroyed by Nazi Germans. They had served their purpose of the liquidation of the ghettoized Jews or Red Army prisoners, and in some cases, Sinti and Roma, Gypsies. And once those populations had been exterminated, these sites were all razed. So there's no liberation of a place like Belzec. It ceases to exist. And even today, there's very little to see at Belzec. Majdanek is a different story in that the Red Army arrived while there were still prisoners there. And in fact, the Nazis had failed to blow up the crematoria and other elements that provided evidence for the crimes against humanity there. So the most notorious sites were never liberated, and therefore we have to, we measure our words when we talk about the liberation of Europe and even the Allied victory in Europe. What does it mean to be victorious when 6 million Jews have been murdered and 27 million Russians died and many millions of others? What does victory really mean in that context? The main symbol which emerged after the war of the Shoah and indeed of Nazi crimes was the camp at, well, I call it the camp, but it was really more a complex, an extermination and work complex at Auschwitz-Birkenau. But alone among the sites in the East, only Auschwitz uniquely had prisoners, about 7,000 prisoners who were still there when the Red Army arrives in the end of January 1945. Prior to that, approximately 60,000 prisoners had been marched to sites further west, that is, the sites up and down Germany that then were liberated by the British and the Americans and the French in the spring of 1945. I refer to Bergen-Belsen and Dora and Buchenwald and Dachau. Many of the same prisoners who had been in the East find themselves in these camps in Germany, and therefore it is here that they are liberated. If they had been marched from Auschwitz in the death marches. The site at Birkenau, well, I like to say if you go to Auschwitz, be sure to go to Birkenau. That's the real Auschwitz. That's the one that still has a sense of the monstrous, whereas the other, Auschwitz I, is really just a museum of Nazi German crimes and a museum of the Holocaust, and not even the best Holocaust museum, which today I think is certainly in London. So if you haven't seen the galleries at the Imperial War Museum, I would recommend doing that on your next trip over. Auschwitz was several things at once. As I said, it was a work camp. It was a site of extermination. It was a place where healthy young adults between about the ages of 15 and 30 were worked to death. For most of the people who passed through Auschwitz, their experience there was measured just in hours, a few hours, maybe 2 hours, time to be stripped and not tattooed, simply stripped and shaved and corralled to gas chambers, and then their bodies incinerated, their bones crushed, and their ashes dumped in ponds. Auschwitz was unique in that it was neither fully destroyed nor evacuated. And so we have many, many thousands of witnesses of what occurred in Auschwitz, both surviving Jews and also surviving Gentile prisoners, especially the Polish prisoners of war. Very few of the Red Army soldiers who were imprisoned there survived. They were all starved to death. Almost none of the gypsies survived Auschwitz to creating any kind of a testimony of the experience there. They were all that gypsy camp was exterminated on the 2nd of August, 1944. So about just 6 months prior to the liberation. Now, I said that 7,000 prisoners were left at Auschwitz at the end of the war. That may seem like a small number when we set it against the millions who were murdered. However, keep in mind the two most important canonical works of post-war memory of the Holocaust come from two of those survivors. Primo Levi, who I'll talk about in a moment, and Otto Frank, who was there as well on the 27th of January. And he was able to go back to Amsterdam and find his daughter's diary, which was still sitting there in her room. The survivors were greeted the Red Army soldiers, many of whom arrived on skis, the dead of winter. They appeared to them as angels, is what they all said. What became of these survivors? Well, for the Polish Jews who were in Auschwitz, the question of returning home was quickly revealed as a non-starter, because you had across the second half of 1945 and 46 a series of pogroms in Poland against surviving Jews, and the town of Kielce is emblematic. Here, Jews had been about maybe a third of the population of 75,000. About 200 survived the camps, returned home, and the reaction of their Polish Gentile neighbors was basically, what? We thought the Jews had all been killed. And they were set upon, and a quarter of those returning Jews were killed in a pogrom in the summer of 1946. It became clear that Poland, indeed perhaps much of Eastern Europe, was no longer a safe place for Jews, even after the defeat of the Nazi Germans. But the question was, where would they go to? Where are they to go? Israel didn't exist. There were no open, the immigration restrictions hadn't been lifted in places like South America or the United States yet. So many of these Jews languished in displaced persons camps in West Germany for 2 or 3 years before they began to emigrate. There was no question of many of them staying in Germany either, or returning to Austria. Well, what can we say about the way the world acquired knowledge of the camp experience? In fact, before the liberations in the end of 1944-45, already there were attempts to disseminate knowledge of what was going on in Eastern Europe, in the ghettos and the camps. Think about Jan Karski's report from the end of 1942. Karski had traveled in ghettoized Poland, had witnessed the extermination, and he managed to get to London and then to New York, Washington, and report on these crimes. There was really no action taken. Or think about the case of Emanuel Ringelblum, who agreed to stay in the Warsaw Ghetto, and as a historian, he sought to create an archive of the ghetto, which he then buried in milk containers. And he himself was killed in the ghetto walls when the ghetto was liquidated. But later on, the archive there was discovered, so we know a great deal about the Warsaw Ghetto from Emanuel Ringelblum. There were also those who, immediately after the war, sought to collect stories of survivors. For example, David Boder, a Jew born in Tsarist Russia who had settled in the United States, he returned to Europe in 1946, visited these displaced persons camps that I just talked about, and recorded on this new technology, basically recording on a wire. He recorded the testimonies of survivors that agreed to speak with him. Of course, the Holocaust didn't exist yet. I mean, it hadn't been conceptualized. We didn't know that the death marches were the death marches. There was no name for them. We didn't even have a word for Holocaust survivor. When David Boder talked to survivors, they identified themselves as political prisoners. So there was no Holocaust yet. That had to be forged through the work of survivor testimonies, historians, archaeology. Little by little, the survivor accounts began to disseminate. There was a lot of resistance to this. There was resistance on the one hand because, well, many of the survivors were in no position to testify or to write their memoirs. Many are in psychiatric hospitals. In the 1950s, Israeli psychiatric hospitals are full of survivors. They will never give any evidence or talk about their experiences. They're too scarred by the event. But you do have individuals who write their memoirs. People like, well, probably the central figure is Primo Levi, Marceline Loredan-Evans, who I'll talk about in a moment. So you have the beginning of a canon. Probably the most important early work is Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, also known by its Americanized title, Survival in Auschwitz. And Levi, as a scientist, as a trained scientist, he approaches the experience in Auschwitz with a kind of forensic detachment. He's an Italian Jew. He sees it as essential for an Italian to bear witness to the crimes that were committed at Auschwitz, because in his conception, Nazism was a kind of metastasized version of the Italian fascist cancer. So, and it was apropos that the first great book about the camp experience would be written by an Italian. And I recommend it to you, but even more important than his prose accounts, and he wrote 3 or 4, he became a kind of professional eyewitness. I mean, it became his life to visit schools. I don't know how many thousands of schools across Italy he visited. And he wrote these memoirs that are key. I see a few of my students here. We all read these books together in class. But his poetry is perhaps more visceral, more jarring, more direct. The novelized memoirs tend to be a little more sanitized. But one of my favorite of his poems, of all the Holocaust poems, for Primo Levi, disseminating the story of the Holocaust, telling the world what had occurred, was he likened it to a crow flying to your window and coming in unwanted and telling you something you don't want to hear. I have come from far off to bring bad news. I flew over the mountain. I flew through the low cloud. My belly was mirrored in the swamp. I have flown without rest for 100 miles without rest, so as to find your window, so as to find your ear, to bring you the sad news, which will take the joy from your sleep, which will spoil your bread and wine, which will sit every evening on your heart. You can see why there would have been such resistance. Europe is rebuilding, Europe is moving forward, people want to get on with their lives, everyone had suffered. They don't want to hear the stories of what happened in the camps. Another author who's writing fairly early in all of this that I recommend to you is Charlotte Delbo. Charlotte Delbo is not Jewish. She was sent to Auschwitz by mistake. She's a Gentile French resistor. She never should have been there, but she's there, and she is an eyewitness to the extermination of the gypsies and the Jews. She writes about this in her book, Auschwitz and After. And for me, Charlotte Delbo is a key figure in all of this because she's not Jewish. And I know that because of what many of the survivors said, many of the Jews said, that the whole experience of the camps and the death marches, you can't possibly appreciate it unless you were there, unless you were, what they're saying is really unless you're Jewish. Otherwise, it's unknowable. It's ungraspable. And what Charlotte Delbo says, no. It's universal. It's a human story. You don't have to be Jewish. I'm not Jewish. And it's a story for everyone. And the beginning of her book, Auschwitz and After, is so searing the way it draws you in. She begins with the trains and the idea that there's a train station in the world that's unlike any other station. People arrive, they look through the crowd of those who are waiting, those who await them. They kiss them and say the trip exhausted them. People leave. This is a regular station she's talking about. People leave. They say goodbye to those who are not leaving and hug the children. There is a street for people who arrive and a street for people who leave. There is a cafe called Arrivals and a cafe called Departures. There are people who arrive and there are people who leave. But there's a station where those who arrive are those who are leaving, a station where those who arrive have never arrived and those who have left never came back. She's talking about Auschwitz. I also like, and I use a lot, the French survivor Marceline Loredan Evans, née Rosenberg, who lived all the way until 2018. And her, if you can get a hold of one of her books translated, or maybe in French if you want to work on your high school French, I really find her an essential person in all of this. Well, let me just say one more thing about the the revelations of the camps. They provoke tremendous anger, tremendous horror in the West. Less so in the Soviet Union, and the liberation, for example, of Majdanek or Auschwitz is not an event that is presented the same way to the Soviet audience than for example, the liberations of Mauthausen or Bergen-Belsen would be in the West. And the reason is very simple. The Soviets didn't need to see a lot of evidence of German crimes against humanity. They had lived that. But people who are living in the Americas or maybe in Northern Ireland, in England or Scotland, there was a duty by the Allied command to expose them to not only the Nazi crimes, but also make a case for why the war was fought, why it had been so costly. However, in Germany itself, the dissemination of stories or pictures or media films about the crimes that had been committed in their name, that media campaign is short-lived. It pretty much ends by the summer of 1945. It only lasts a few months. There was a decision already that Germany would be a key player in the Cold War, and in order to not alienate Germans, it was necessary to move on. So there are a few trials. Some of the leadership after Nuremberg is tried or imprisoned. There are 8 people hung. There are a few other trials having to do with the industrial captains, the I.G. Farben trials, the Auschwitz trials. There are all these camp trials, but there's no collective punishment. That's the bottom line, no collective punishment. So you have the beginnings of this canon. You can read about the events of the Holocaust, of even the internment of Gentiles. And then the representations begin. And it becomes quite a rich subgenre of cinema, more so the cinema than almost any other genre. I mean, there is quite a bit of poetry, as I said. I think we need more poetry. There's a lot of fiction. In fact, most of my students who come to learn with me in their 3rd level or 1st level at Queen's, they have read fiction from probably the end of their primary education, and fiction that is not consistent with serious academic studies of the war or the Holocaust. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but they all know fictional accounts, some of which the premise of these accounts is fully absurd. And the starting point in my class is leave all of that behind and let's use empirical evidence and the canonical works that we can read and discuss, maybe interrogate some of those works that I just mentioned. In terms of song, very limited in terms of popular song. For whatever reason, we don't sing songs about the Holocaust. I'm not sure why. We don't sing songs about the Holocaust or the camps or the liberations. I mean, there are more songs about the Columbia River in the 1930s than there are about the camps in the 1940s. The only pop music or folk music that I know that dares to sing about the Holocaust, there was one song that Joan Baez sang on tour in Europe in the 1970s or the end of the 70s. There's one song called For Sasha. It's the only one I know sung by any figure that you can name, any band or group. No one else touches it. The cinema is different. Cinema is quite rich. I mean, even pictures that you might not associate with the Holocaust. I'm here to tell you today, you're watching a Holocaust movie. like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. I mean, he's flown to London in 1945 to create a camp film that is going to be shown to the Germans. And he works there in the summer of 1945 on this camp film, which included footage shot by the Red Army of the dynamited gas chambers. He knew all about it. The film was canceled because of the Cold War, but that's neither here nor there. But so Hitchcock is familiar with this. 15 years later, Psycho, what is this if not a gas chamber nightmare? Another one that I like, that I use, is Harold and Maude. Again, most of you are too young to remember Harold and Maude. It is a story of a Holocaust survivor, an 80-year-old woman who was in the camps who has a tattoo. You only briefly see that Maude is a survivor of Auschwitz, but the story of the film and her love of life is a lesson about the nature of survival, and it reminds us that all of those who were murdered in the Holocaust and in the camps, they all wanted to live. A kind of exploitation film that I like, that I showed my students last term, is Marathon Man, which is can only be called a Holocaust revenge fantasy. And then the one that really moved things along, the soap opera, the Holocaust miniseries soap opera from 1978 called Holocaust, with a kind of all-star cast and Meryl Streep and some others. And this was the one that put gave a name to the event. We didn't call it the Holocaust. Most people thought Holocaust was a Jewish holiday until this film came out. And Holocaust was the first time that American audiences were exposed to the horrors of the camps. In this case, it's not Auschwitz. Auschwitz emerges later as really in the 1990s, is the central symbol of the Holocaust. But until then, the Holocaust film is about Treblinka. It's about the extermination at Treblinka outside of Warsaw. The film then goes to Europe, and it makes a big impression on the Germans when it's released there in a dubbed version the next year. I mean, there was a cynical joke they told in Germany at the time that the Holocaust, the soap opera, it had a bigger impact than the original. The one that I like that gave, I mean, it's interesting that the names for these, the two names that we give to this human event, Holocaust and Shoah, both come from movies. Holocaust from the 1978 soap opera, and Shoah from the 1985 French film, which I don't call a documentary. It's not a documentary. It's sometimes called that. It's very unique. It's 9.5 hours long. It's a series of interviews with those who were close to the final moment. The purpose of the film was to get as close to the death in the gas chambers as possible. That's what it's about. So by the early 1980s, the stories of survivors, the stories of the camps, has an audience, and it has people who want to tell the story. And from there, everything moves on exponentially. And most spectacularly, in the biggest budget and most widely disseminated film of all, the Holocaust epic by Steven Spielberg in 1993, which occurred at a moment that I would call the age of consensus. This was a period when the Holocaust was told with happy endings. And Schindler's List has a happy ending. It's the story of a good German who saved Jews. Perhaps incongruous when you think about the wider sweep of the complicity of German industrialists and German civilians, but this is the story of one good German and the 1,000 Jews he told. A true story, and one worth telling, but it's the picture that catapults the Holocaust to a wider audience. And since then, the cinematic representations, I think, have been improving. Just in the last few years, some really good ones have come out. Probably the best is called The Son of Saul, now 10 years old, which is a day in the life of a Sonderkommando worker in the Auschwitz gas chambers. And it captures the visceral, the oral qualities probably better than any other. I also liked Occupied City by Steve McQueen, which is the contemporary resonance of the deportations in Amsterdam. A picture that you may not have heard of in French, I don't think it played here at all, is called Une jeune fille qui va bien. I can't remember the translation, but it's about a young woman in Paris who is destined for extermination, deportation, and it's the moments of her life leading up to that. Zone of Interest, which you've heard about, and then 3 Minutes, which is a film, a discovered film of Jews in a village in Poland on the eve of the war. And it's not a Holocaust film, it's about the lives of individuals taken in a single 3-minute picture, and we know that they were all exterminated. Let me say something about the other representations that are somewhat interesting or represent a kind of departure. Now, the most celebrated of these is a graphic novel. Maus was attacked when it was serialized in the 1980s. And Art Spiegelman, the American author whose parents were Holocaust survivors, he talked about taking this graphic novel, this comic book about Auschwitz, to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and all of these old German literary critics came by and told him how inappropriate it was to write a graphic novel about Auschwitz. And he always said the same thing. He said, no, Auschwitz was inappropriate. My novel is a representation of that. This period of Schindler's List, the 1990s, I'm so glad that period in the memory of the camps is over. It was really something to behold. On the one hand, you had this feel-good film by Spielberg, but then you also had the soundtrack played by Itzhak Perlman, the most schmaltzy kind of music that you can imagine, especially if you're aware of the sound universe of the actual camps, where sound, music, industrial sounds, Strauss waltzes, all of these things were a form of torture. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, the soundtrack to Schindler's List, which you heard constantly in those days, this became one of the two works that musically symbolized this event. The other was Gorecki's Third Symphony, which played constantly on the radio in the 1990s, one of the great classical hits, and again, nothing that would seem to evoke the absolute horror of the camps. A more successful musical interpretation I found was a kind of unique performance that took place in Paris in 2010. This was the site of the warehousing of pianos that had been stolen from French Jews, and the French Jewish French apartments had all been ransacked, and all their belongings had been sent back to Germany. And all of these pianos that were taken from French Jews, those are all still in Germany today. None of them were ever recovered. But before they were taken, they were stored in the Palace of Tokyo. And in 2010, an installation was created where a pianist in the bowels of the building performed on a piano, and you could hear the sounds of this piano going up through the exhibition spaces further up. And it was as if the sound of the piano, the walls were breathing the pain of that, the musical manifestation of that human suffering and dislocation. I wanted to say something about the memorials and a few that may be worth exploring. It's another way that the memory of this human experience lives on. The most affecting for me is the one at PRONI in Lithuania. Here, the Germans discovered these fuel depots, these big trenches. They're circular, 5-meter deep holes in the ground, and they decided that this would be a good place to execute the Jewish population of Lithuania. About 100,000 people were murdered here, and today the site is it's one of the calmest, least visited, most affecting places that I've gone to. But there are many others that I think are evidence of the remarkable degree of ingenuity and creativity and sensitivity of people all over Europe who want to remember these events. I like, for example, the empty library in Berlin. It's a very small site. It's easy to miss. It's just some bookshelves that are set into the ground and illuminated, and they're empty. And it is a metaphor for the burning of books, but also the extermination of lives of people who never had a chance to write their books or tell their stories. A similar motif in Vienna at the memorial to the 65,000 Austrian Jews who were murdered. And here we have a kind of library where all the books are turned so their title, the title and the jacket is turned in, and all you can see are the pages. Well, it's of course made of concrete, but it gives you a sense of, again, a kind of library that would never be written. Once you start looking for these in Paris, you'll never spend a vacation there the same way again, because on every school all over Paris, you have these plaques that remember the children and the teachers who were deported there in 1943, and they are on every school. This was done about 25 years ago. The Berlin Memorial, which is called the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. That's the title of it. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Now, I don't know what you think of this, but if the Nazi Germans had won the war and they had decided at some point to create a memorial, a monument to their achievement of the extermination, it would have looked just like this. And they would have called it the Memorial to the Murder of the Jews of Europe. This memorial is a real problem in terms of the visitor experience and visitor behavior, because the recessed valleys that go through these large monoliths, these tombstone-like monoliths, they invite a kind of whimsy, and there's a lot of, you see people doing things here that are just incomprehensible, like juggling, or many people like to jump over them. And a few years ago, an Israeli performance artist created the site called the Holocaust, where he juxtaposed these pictures, which he took off social media, of individuals doing whimsical things at the Berlin Memorial, and he would juxtapose them with the bodies of the typical pictures that we know from Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald. So these, and the arrangement was, if you apologized for your behavior, then he would take the picture of you down. They don't do this anymore. It's a defunct site. The most homogenized form of memorial of the victims, and not just Jewish victims, but also Gypsy, Roma, and Gentiles, and, well, Gypsy, Roma are Gentiles. They are, they're regular neighbors who have been Catholics for 1,000 years. So they're the Jews, Gentiles, anyone who was taken out of their apartment and deported to a camp, they are eligible for one of these skipping stones, the Stolpersteine, which have been around for 25 years now, and which you see all over Europe, wherever people were deported. They're the creation of a German artist, and it's one of the most satisfying forms of memorial, not least because there's always a collective involved. So it's either the children of a school who research and find out that there was a family that was deported across the street from their school, and so they do the research and they engage the artist, and then they're a part of this event, which is a kind of ceremony. And once you travel around Europe and you start looking for these, you see them everywhere. This is one that I saw in front of my hotel in Salzburg. And it always has a few elements that are the same. So it's the name of the person. It says, here lived, hier wohnte, the name of the person, the name of birth, the year of birth, the deportation date, when they would have been taken from, obviously, whatever block of flats doesn't exist anymore. Now it's a 4-star hotel. And then where they were deported to and when they were murdered. And you see these everywhere. Here are some that I saw in Salzburg. These are others that I saw in Salzburg. These are in Ostrava, actually, on the way to Auschwitz in eastern Czechia. The other memorials that I find very interesting are the ones at Père Lachaise in Paris. And I can't think of any other cemetery anywhere in the world where they've reserved an area to remember all of the camps. All of them have memorials set up for them there. Across the river on the right bank, you can visit the memorial to the children of the Veldiv roundup that occurred in summer of 1942. This was a roundup where over 4,000 children were sent to Auschwitz, and they have there this memorial garden, and it's very, it's quite unique among all the memorials in the world. For starters, it's the only one I ever visited where they have a box of stones, and it says, help yourself. And you can take a stone, and you can, in the Jewish tradition, you put a stone to mark the dead, to honor the dead. And you can do this, and you have a wall of all of the names of the dead children, of the murdered children. And then you have, opposite this wall, you have the stories of their lives, which is quite unique, I think. It's not something you ever encounter, for example, at the Auschwitz Museum. You don't learn the backstory of any of those around 1 million Jews and 20,000 gypsies were murdered at Auschwitz. You don't learn the story of any of their lives. You do at the Paris Memorial. And I'll tell you how to get there. It's easy to remember, because when you're going to the Eiffel Tower and you arrive at it's called, what is it called? It's got an Arab name, Berkin, the metro station there. And all the tourists are going to be filing out. And when they get out of the station, they're going to turn right to go to the Eiffel Tower, right? It says here, Tour Eiffel. And when they're all turning right out of the metro, you turn left. And you go 1/2 a block, and just under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, there is the memorial to the Veldiv roundup. Another memorial that is very moving to me when I learned about this was something called Letters to Henio. Henio was a Jewish boy who lived in Lublin, and he was exterminated at the site at Majdanek, which was the first picture I showed you, the site of the first liberation by the Russians, July 1944. And Lublin has always existed in the shadow of this camp. And it's the unspeakable nature of the Majdanek experience was such that finally someone came up with a good idea. And that was, we can't process the tens of thousands who were killed here. We can't learn about their lives, all of them. It's too many. What we're going to do is just focus on one person. and everyone's going to learn his name and what he looked like, and everyone's going to write a letter to him on his birthday. And this is what they've been doing in this town. There's a special mailbox set up in front of the apartment where he lived with his family, and people show up there on this one day every year, and they drop off a letter. It's a kind of memorial. Well, I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions, then I have to run back to work, but I want to suggest just that there are a number of directions that the future of all of this is going, I think. And the first is the incredible potential of the digitization of the archives and of research, and especially the photography collections. We have now a new EU-sponsored research consortium called the Visual History of the Holocaust, which is really unthinkable just a few years ago. And a lot of work is being done on the analysis of pictures and photography, and using these to flesh out parts of the story that are not understood. So a lot of work in the area of photography. The other area that is it's almost the antithesis of this technological revolution, and that is the archaeological work that's being done at many sites today. The nature of the Nazi crime and the German thinking in the crime was that they would, when they had liquidated a ghetto, they had finished a site like Belzec or Chelmno, when it no longer served a purpose, they would dynamite the site and they would bury everything under a few centimeters of earth. And they thought that this would disappear their crime. What they didn't understand was that the earth is a very good place to preserve evidence. What is that saying in Latin from the Roman period? The earth is the most just. And under the soil here, in all of these places, wherever you have mass graves or evidence of gas chambers or the Holocaust by bullets, in all of these places, under the earth is speaking. And today it's speaking to the archaeologists, young university students and volunteers who are going to these places in the summer, and they're digging. And a lot of these sites now, the former camps, they're big archaeological digs now. That's part of the future of the field, right? Now, the other issue that we are confronted with today more than ever is a kind of biological imperative, the inevitability of the dying out of the final eyewitnesses to the camps, to the experience of the camps and the liberations. And there are only a few left. I mean, believe me when I tell you, 20 years ago when I took my students to Auschwitz, you would go through Auschwitz and all of the groups were led by a guide who had been there. And you could see the guide remembering and talking to the students about what it was like, the daily routine that they did, and they were all being led around by these guides who were speaking in Hungarian or in Hebrew or in English or in Yiddish, and that whole experience is pretty much gone now. I mean, when I started teaching the Holocaust in St. Louis, Missouri in 2002, I think 2001, and I wanted to bring a Holocaust survivor in to talk to my students. And believe me when I tell you that she was one phone call away. And I called her up. I got her name from the head of the department, and her name was Hetty Epstein. And she came in. She was a Kindertransport girl. And she came in and she spoke to the students. And the students were in their desks, and Hetty was up in the front. This went on all the time in classrooms in Europe or the United States. Here too, I know the Mill Isle children were in the schools here all the time. And at the end of her talk, she would say, well, I have a few minutes now if anyone would like to come up and ask me a question. And all of the students rushed up to her and they wanted to touch her. They wanted to, I don't know exactly what they were hoping to accomplish. Maybe they wanted to, some of her luck to rub off on them, or they wanted to pick up some of her pain. But that visceral, direct human connection with the Holocaust, with the camps, it's all over now. You have one or two women who are still going with students. Jeanette Kalinka, who's a French survivor who was in Auschwitz when she was 15 years old. She's still alive as of this morning. I checked before I came in. She takes students to Auschwitz, and she wrote a book a few years ago. And you have, living in England, a name you probably know because she was a cellist in the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, Anita Lasker-Ballfish. She was at the 80th anniversary in commemoration in January. She's still with us. And otherwise, we are now transitioning to a period of the post-survivor era. And what is that going to look like? What will it mean for pedagogy and for learning once the last survivor is gone? Will it be the case where if you met a survivor, you will become the new teacher or pedagogue? Will it be a kind of the witness to the witness? And people will say, yes, here is this teacher, and when he was young, he met survivors of Auschwitz in New York at a bar mitzvah in the 1970s, and they're all gone now. But if you want to know what they were like, you can talk to him. Is that what it's going to be like? Or will you have, like they do at the LA Jewish Museum, they have holograms? So you're able to access an interview with a survivor of the camps through a hologram? I'm not sure. But I will, for a long time, I was rather pessimistic about the prospect of the future of our awareness of the camps once the last survivor was gone. But that was before I learned about a rather obscure element in medieval Jewish mysticism, which is called the angel of forgetting. This angel of forgetting is someone that any rabbi would talk to you about. The angel of forgetting, I'll tell you the story in a nutshell. In Jewish mysticism, there is this idea that babies are born with the collective knowledge and the collective pain of the world. It's a little like the idea of the collective subconscious, if you know Jungian psychology. And this idea is that all babies are born with all collective knowledge. So all babies are born with knowledge of all of the tribulations of mankind. But of course, this is a terrible burden for a little child. And to assuage that burden, an angel comes down at the birth of every child, the angel of forgetting. And the angel kisses every newborn baby on just below her nose, right here. And if you ever wondered why you have this little groove under your nose and why you might touch it if you're trying to remember something, this is where the angel of forgetting kissed you. But the angel of forgetting is herself very forgetful. And she doesn't remember to kiss all the babies. Some babies never get kissed. And the baby that isn't kissed by the angel of forgetting, that baby will remember everything. And she will tell our stories. Thank you.